The plane door opened. 5 heavily armed police officers boarded. Their target was her, a black woman. The reason was that she looked like a wanted criminal on TV. No kind words, no request to check her papers. 5 men in uniform, representing the law, acting on a vague accusation and immediate prejudice. They rushed at her, shouting and accusing her in front of hundreds of astonished eyes. She tried to explain. She tried to stay calm, but they didn't listen. All they saw was the color of her skin and the criminal stereotype they had hastily imposed. The slurs and insults poured out, and then they used force. She was violently dragged from her seat, restrained, publicly humiliated, escorted off the plane like a real criminal just because she looked like someone on a blurry news story. The mission she was carrying out was of the utmost importance, a mission that could affect national security at risk of being completely destroyed. The policemen had no idea of the terrible mistake they had just made. They had no idea who the woman they were trampling on really was. What consequences await them when the truth is revealed? And will justice come in time to right this fatal wrong? Let's listen to this story. The steady roar of jet engines outside the Airbus A321's small windows was deafening, but inside the economy cabin, the air was relatively quiet. Passengers were settling into their seats for the morning flight from Atlanta to Miami. Soft chatter, the clatter of overhead bins, and the sound of a safety announcement coming from the loudspeakers, the familiar sounds of a commercial flight about to depart. In seat 14A, near the window, FBI agent Maya Jenkins tried to blend into that normalcy. She wore dark jeans, a white shirt, and a simple vest, a smart but unobtrusive outfit that perfectly suited her role as a consultant on a short business trip. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun, and her face was bare of makeup, only her thin-rimmed glasses partially concealing her intelligent, sharp, and always alert eyes. On the surface, Maya looked like any other female passenger, perhaps a little tired or focused on work, but inside, her mind was racing. This was no ordinary flight. It was a pivotal phase of Operation Golden Eagle, a nearly 2-year top-secret operation to dismantle an international terrorist financing network that was funneling money into the United States through sophisticated money laundering channels. A few rows away across the aisle was The Package, the code name for Khalid al-Jamil, a key cog in the network who held highly sensitive information about potential attack plans and the identities of higher-level plotters. Maya's mission today was simple, but nerve-wracking. Keep a low profile on al-Jamil throughout the flight, ensuring he arrived safely at his rendezvous point in Miami, where another FBI team was ready to approach him and persuade him to cooperate or, if necessary, make an arrest. Any unwanted attention, any incident that spooked al-Jamil and changed his plans could derail the entire operation, putting lives at risk and wasting the efforts of hundreds of agents. Maya took a deep breath, trying to calm her heart, which was beating a little faster than usual. She pretended to be reading an economic article on her tablet, which had a privacy screen installed, but in reality, her eyes were secretly observing everything around her from the corner of her eyes and the reflection on the dark screen. She noticed al-Jamil sitting quietly, reading a book, looking calm. Good. This silence was what she needed. But that fragile peace is about to be broken by an unexpected source. In the 10th row, Carol Fletcher, a white woman in her late 60s, was fidgeting. She had just returned from visiting her daughter in Atlanta and was on her way home to Florida. As she waited, she scrolled through the news on her large-screen smartphone. A sensational report about an armed bank robbery in Georgia a few days earlier caught her eye. The report included a blurry sketch and low-quality security video of the suspect, a black woman who was described as dangerous and possibly still at large. Mrs. Fletcher raised her head, habitually scanning the cabin, and her eyes happened to fall on Maya Jenkins. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman in row 14, there was something familiar about her. Of course, the image on the news was blurry, but the figure, the black hair tied in a bun, and most importantly, the skin color, it reminded her of that dangerous female criminal. At first, Mrs. Fletcher had some doubts about herself. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then her inherent fear of crime, of personal safety, and of underlying prejudices about black people that she might never have acknowledged began to rise strongly. She looked at Maya a few more times, trying to find suspicious signs. Maya, sitting quietly, focused on her tablet, not talking to anyone, suddenly seemed cold, mysterious, and suspicious to Mrs. Fletcher. It can't be a coincidence, she told herself. It looks too much like her. What if it really is her? Does she have a weapon? What will happen on this flight? Panic began to take over her. She felt it was her civic duty to report it. Better to be wrong than to miss, she justified her fear and prejudice. Mrs. Fletcher looked around for the flight attendant. As a young stewardess passed by, she quickly raised her hand in a discreet but urgent gesture. The stewardess paused, smiling professionally. "May I help you?" "Shh." Mrs. Fletcher motioned for the stewardess to lean closer, then whispered in a voice that trembled with anxiety and excitement. "That girl in seat 14A, I think she's the wanted woman on TV. The bank robbery in Georgia. She looks exactly like her. Very dangerous." She might have unintentionally exaggerated the resemblance or added suspicious details about Maya's demeanor. The flight attendant was a little taken aback but remained professional. She was trained to handle situations like this. She reassured Mrs. Fletcher, asked her to remain calm and remain seated, then quickly walked to the front of the plane to report to the chief flight attendant and the captain, following proper security procedures. The news that a passenger suspected of identifying a wanted criminal was on board quickly spread from the cockpit to the ground security department at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport. And like a snowball rolling downhill, the initial information, though based on vague suspicions and personal prejudices, set off a chain reaction of operations whose disastrous consequences no one could have foreseen. Maya was still focused on monitoring the Al-Jamil target and analyzing the situation when she suddenly felt the plane slowing down on the alternate runway, even though it was not yet time for takeoff. It was a small anomaly, but enough to make her sixth sense as a seasoned agent become more acute. She glanced out the window, then discreetly observed the crew's reaction. Something was wrong. A few minutes later, the captain announced over the loudspeaker in a calm voice, "Dear passengers, due to an urgent security reason, we are forced to temporarily suspend the departure. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the crew. We will update the information as soon as possible." The cabin began to buzz. Passengers looked at each other nervously, whispering guesses. Maya's heart beat faster. A security emergency? Was this related to her mission? Had Al-Jamil been exposed? Or was there some other threat? Questions and scenarios raced through her head at breakneck speed. She tried to keep her face calm, continuing to pretend to read on her tablet, but every sense was on high alert. Then the main door of the plane, which had been closed in preparation for departure, suddenly swung open again. Noises from outside drifted in. And then they appeared. 5 men in Atlanta Police Department uniforms boarded the plane, looking nervous and anxious. Leading the way was a white man in his 50s, wearing the rank of sergeant, with a stern face but an impatient and somewhat aggressive look in his eyes. His name tag read Sergeant Drummond. 4 other younger officers followed closely behind, their hands on their holsters or clutching batons at their waists. Their presence instantly filled the air with fear and confusion. They barely paid any attention to the greeting or question from the chief steward standing near the door. Sergeant Drummond merely jerked his chin and asked curtly, "Where is the subject?" The young stewardess who had taken the report from Mrs. Fletcher seemed a little shaken by the policeman's attitude, but still pointed toward the back of the cabin. In seat 14A, sir. Sergeant Drummond and the four officers' eyes immediately turned to Maya Jenkins. They strode quickly down the narrow aisle, their boots clicking heavily on the floor of the plane. Passengers sitting along the aisle cowered, pressing closer to their seats. Maya watched them approach, her heart sinking. There had to be some mistake. But their attitude was too aggressive, too determined. She knew she had to remain absolutely calm. Anything that could be interpreted as resistance would only make things worse and could expose her true identity to Al-Jamil. As the police stopped right next to her bench, Sergeant Drummond stared at her with a critical, judgmental gaze. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't ask to see her identification. He didn't offer any explanation. Instead, he barked, his voice full of authority. "You there! Stand up right now! Put your hands above your head!" Drummond's shout echoed throughout the cabin, causing everyone to panic even more. Maya was momentarily stunned by the brutality and absurdity. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm and unshaken. "Officer, what's going on?" "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" Drummond sneered, a sneer that was full of contempt. "Don't play dumb with me. We know who you are. Someone on this flight recognized you from the wanted poster." He said the last sentence loudly, as if he wanted to condemn her in front of everyone. "Wanted poster?" Maya frowned, confusion and anger rising. "There must be some serious mistake. I'm not the person you're looking for. I can show you my identification to verify." "Shut up!" Drummond cut her off harshly, his impatience evident on his face. "What tricks can a cunning criminal like you play that we don't know about? Get up at once, or else we'll have to use force." Maya realized the situation was spiraling out of control. There was no point in arguing. But she couldn't just follow such an unreasonable order. She needed time, needed to figure out what the hell was going on and how to get out of this situation without ruining the mission. She remained seated, trying to keep her eyes steady on Drummond. Her hesitation was, in Drummond's eyes, a challenge. He could not accept that a black bitch would dare not obey his orders immediately. He gritted his teeth and turned to signal the two young officers standing closest. "She won't cooperate! Pull her out!" The two policemen on command immediately sprang into action. They did not hesitate to bend down, grabbed Maya's arms forcefully, and tried to pull her out of the chair she was sitting on. "Wait!" Maya cried out, instinctively yanking her hand away and trying to hold herself to the chair. "What are you guys doing? You can't do this! This is illegal!" Drummond immediately interpreted the feeble act of self-defense as fierce resistance. "See? He's resisting!" he shouted, his voice filled with glee at having an excuse to use force. "Restrain him! Handcuff him!" Chaos ensued. The two policemen used overwhelming force, one holding her shoulders and pressing her down, the other twisting her arms behind her back. Maya struggled desperately, not to attack, but simply to protect herself from the brutality and to protest the illegal action. Her screams of pain, the clanking of the handcuffs, the frightened screams of some passengers, the whispers of others, all blended into a chaotic and terrifying sound. While struggling to restrain Maya, Drummond and several other officers did not hesitate to let out insulting, derogatory words, tinged with racial discrimination. "You guys are only good at causing trouble. Are you stubborn? Let's see if you can still be stubborn when you get to the station. Think you can escape, you black bitch? Get her off this plane. Don't let her dirty this place." Maya finally gave in. Her hands were cuffed tightly behind her back, and she was yanked roughly by two officers. Her vest was askew, her hair was a mess. She felt her cheeks burning with anger and humiliation. She was led down the narrow aisle, between rows of chairs filled with curious, fearful, pitying, and judgmental eyes. She glanced quickly at Khalid al-Jamil. He was looking at her, his expression filled with surprise and perhaps wariness. That look stabbed Maya in the heart. The mission had failed, completely failed. 2 years of planning, surveillance, intelligence gathering, all gone in a few short minutes. because of the ignorance, prejudice, and abuse of power of these people. She was pushed out of the plane and through the tunnel in a near-paralyzed state. The pain in her wrist was nothing compared to the pain and despair that was tearing at her heart. She had failed, and she didn't even know how she had gotten into this ridiculous and humiliating situation. Maya was escorted out of the cage and taken to a more secluded waiting area near the gate, where there was less passenger traffic. 5 police officers surrounded her, Sergeant Drummond standing opposite, arms crossed, his expression still hostile and smug about having caught the criminal. "There's no denying it now," Drummond said, his voice patronizing. "We'll take you to the station, verify your identity through the system. For resisting an officer and being wanted, prepare to go to jail." He chuckled, clearly enjoying the prospect. Maya straightened, her hands still painfully cuffed behind her back. The initial shock had passed, replaced by the coolness of an FBI agent assessing a situation and trying to figure out how to turn it around. The primary mission had failed. The target had been passive. The priority now was to stop the situation from getting any further, protect what information could be protected, and ensure that those responsible for this terrible mistake were held accountable. Cover was no longer important. She looked Sergeant Drummond straight in the eye, her voice devoid of fear or confusion, cold, sharp, and filled with hidden power. "Sergeant," she began, her voice clear and distinct, "you and your officers have just made a very, very serious mistake." Drummond frowned, slightly annoyed by the criminal's lack of fear. "A mistake?" he sneered. "The only mistake is that you were stupid enough to let us catch you." "No," Maya replied, her voice firm. "Your mistake was that you acted on preconceived notions and unverified information. Your mistake was that you completely ignored the most basic identification procedures. Your mistake was that you used excessive force, insulted and illegally detained a United States citizen." She paused, her eyes piercing Drummond's soul. "And your biggest mistake," she said, her voice low, emphasizing each word, "was that you obstructed a federal agent in the course of his duty." The words went off like a bomb in midair. Drummond and the other 4 officers froze. The smugness on Drummond's face vanished, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. "Agent federal?" he stammered, his voice shaking. "What? What nonsense are you talking about? Who do you think you're fooling?" But his eyes wavered, and a faint fear began to creep in. The other officers looked at each other, their faces pale. They began to feel that something was really wrong. This woman's unusually calm demeanor, the way she spoke, and her recent statement, it didn't seem like that of a common criminal. Maya didn't give them much time to wonder. She read out a series of numbers. "Agent number 7-4-9-3-1. My name is Special Agent Maya Jenkins, Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterterrorism Unit." She looked straight at Drummond, her voice unwavering. "You have just disrupted and potentially sabotaged a top-secret national security operation. Do you understand the gravity of what you have done?" Silence fell. This time there was no confusion, only absolute terror on the faces of all 5 officers. FBI, federal agents, counterterrorism, national security. The words came crashing down on them like a sledgehammer. Sergeant Drummond's face was as white as a sheet. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He opened his mouth trying to speak, but no words came out. His legs shook. The other 4 officers were worse. One was pale, staggering against the wall. Another began to shake uncontrollably. They looked at Maya as if they were seeing a ghost, then at each other with fear and despair. They knew they had caused a real disaster. At that moment, as if it was prearranged, a group of about 4 or 5 people in plain clothes, but exuding professionalism, coldness, and power, appeared from the waiting room, walking quickly towards them. Their posture, eyes, and the way they moved showed that they were not ordinary airport staff. The man in the lead, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a smart black suit, walked straight up to Sergeant Drummond. His eyes were as cold as knives, sweeping over the 5 cowering policemen, before stopping at Maya and the handcuff marks on her hands. "Sergeant Drummond, Atlanta Police Department," the man said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I am Robert Harrison, Assistant Director in charge of the FBI Atlanta Field Office." He flashed his FBI identification card in front of Drummond. "Special Agent Maya Jenkins is performing her duties under my direct command. For what reason would you handcuff my agent and obstruct federal service?" The question was asked calmly, but its weight almost suffocated Drummond and his subordinates. Drummond stammered, trying to explain the misreport, but his trembling voice and incoherent words could not hide the truth. Assistant Director Harrison didn't seem to want to hear an explanation. He motioned for the agents to follow. "Disarm these 5 officers, their badges, and their radios. They are being held pending investigation of obstruction of federal service and civil rights violations." The FBI agents acted quickly and efficiently. To the dismay of the few remaining airport employees and passengers in the area, the 5 Atlanta police officers, who had been so powerful and domineering a moment ago, were now disarmed and under the complete control of the federal agents. A dramatic and swift reversal of power had taken place before their eyes. A female FBI agent approached Maya and quickly released her handcuffs. "Are you okay, Maya?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with concern. Maya rubbed her red wrists and nodded weakly. "I'm fine, but the mission failed." Her voice was tired and bitter. "We know," Harrison said, stepping closer. "The priority right now is to keep you safe and handle this situation. We'll talk about the mission later." He looked coldly at the 5 officers being held down by his agents. "Take them to the office." The storm has only just begun. The airport incident quickly became a multi-level crisis. News that 5 Atlanta police officers had mistakenly arrested an FBI agent on a top-secret counterterrorism mission and had potentially sabotaged the operation sent shockwaves not only through the FBI and APD, but also to the highest levels of the Justice Department and Atlanta city government. Maya was safely transported to FBI headquarters in Atlanta. After a medical checkup, thankfully she suffered only minor bruises and abrasions to her wrists and arms, she gave a detailed, exhaustive, and emotional debriefing of the entire incident to Assistant Director Harrison and other leaders. She described the officers' behavior, the disregard for protocol, the insults, and most importantly, the moment she realized that Khalid al-Jamil had witnessed the entire arrest. This meant that her cover was blown, al-Jamil would surely alert the network, and any chance of safely approaching or capturing him in Miami was gone. The damage to Operation Golden Eagle was immeasurable. Meanwhile, Sergeant Drummond and 4 of his subordinates, Riley, Chen, Miller, and Davis, were detained at FBI headquarters for separate questioning. Faced with seasoned FBI and Office of Professional Responsibility investigators and fearful of the consequences, their initial toughness quickly crumbled. They admitted to acting on the passenger's unverified report and admitted to failing to check Maya's identity before arresting her. Drummond tried to blame the pressure of the situation and professional instinct, but there was no denying the discriminatory words and actions that had been recorded. The subordinates testified that they were simply following Drummond's orders, but also admitted that they did not question or attempt to intervene, despite sensing something was wrong. A joint investigation by the FBI, the Department of Justice, through the Civil Rights Unit, and the Internal Affairs Bureau, IA, was launched with urgency. Testimonies were taken from Maya, from the FBI agents who intervened, from the flight crew, and from several passengers, including Carol Fletcher, who now felt remorseful and fearful as she learned the consequences of her actions. But the most compelling, irrefutable evidence was the video and audio recordings from the 5 officers' body cameras. The tapes captured the entire truth in plain sight. The officer's hasty disregard for identification, Drummond's arrogant demeanor and racist remarks, the officer's unnecessary use of force, their panic and sudden change of attitude when they learned that Maya was an FBI agent. It was the most eloquent indictment of their wrongdoing. Faced with overwhelming evidence and pressure from the federal government and the public, although the case was kept secret to a certain extent due to national security reasons, information still leaked out, the Atlanta Police Department had no choice but to take drastic action. Within the first week of the incident, Sergeant Bill Drummond and 4 officers, Riley, Chen, Miller, and Davis, were suspended without pay. And just a few weeks later, after the official investigation results were released internally, the Atlanta Police Department director signed a decision to fire all 5 from the force. The reasons were clearly stated: serious violations of professional procedures, abuse of power, excessive use of force, discrimination, violations of civil rights, and causing especially serious consequences affecting national security and seriously damaging the reputation of the police department. The careers of these 5 men came to an ignominious end. But that was not the end of their story. The dismissal from the police force was only the first step. The U.S. Department of Justice, after carefully reviewing the case file, the seriousness of the conduct, and the consequences, decided that a criminal conviction was necessary to ensure deterrence and accountability. A federal indictment was filed, charging all 5 former officers, Bill Drummond, Michael Riley, David Chen, Samuel Miller, and Anthony Davis, with 2 primary charges. 1. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S. Code, Section 242. This crime targets public officials who abuse their delegated authority to intentionally deprive an individual of rights protected by the Constitution or other laws of the United States. In this case, Agent Maya Jenkins's liberty, right to fair treatment, and right to freedom from discrimination. 2. Obstruction of justice, obstruction of federal official service. The unlawful detention and disruption of Special Agent Maya Jenkins's duties constituted obstruction of the lawful conduct of a federal agency, FBI. The trial of 5 former police officers in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia in Atlanta has attracted intense media and public attention, although many details about Maya's assignment remain secret for security reasons. The case has become a focal point for debates about racial discrimination in law enforcement, police accountability, and the complex relationship between local and federal authorities. In the courtroom, the 5 defendants sat side by side, their faces showing signs of fatigue, worry, and belated regret. They no longer had the aggressive, confident air of men in uniform and power. On the prosecution side, Justice Department attorneys presented a compelling case, focusing not only on the personal injustice suffered by Special Agent Maya Jenkins, but also on the grave national security consequences of the defendant's rash and prejudiced actions. The body cam footage once again became central evidence, presented in court, silencing the courtroom with its stark display of abuse of power and discrimination. Special Agent Maya Jenkins was called to testify. She appeared as an FBI agent, professional and calm. She recounted the events objectively, without exaggerating her personal emotions, focusing on describing the defendant's misconduct and its direct impact on the critical mission she was performing. Her testimony as a federal law enforcement officer carried special weight. The defense tried to build an argument that the defendants were victims of a series of errors and misunderstandings stemming from passenger Carol Fletcher's initial report. They argued that the defendants acted under extreme stress and pressure and simply overreacted without any intention to discriminate against a race or undermine a federal mission. They tried to appeal to the jury's sympathy, emphasizing the defendants' lost careers, their waiting families, and their remorse. However, in the face of clear evidence, especially the body cam footage and Maya's testimony, the defense arguments were weak. After several days of trial and deliberation, the jury of 12 people gave their final verdict. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as the jury foreman rose to read the verdict. The words, "guilty," rang out clearly for each defendant on both main charges, putting an end to the faint hopes of the 5 former police officers. A few weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. The federal judge who presided over the case read the verdict in a stern tone. He emphasized that racial bias and abuse of power are unacceptable behaviors in any civilized society, especially from those entrusted with the responsibility of protecting the law and serving the people. He pointed out that the fact that all 5 officers were present at the scene and none of them spoke up or questioned their colleagues' misconduct was a serious problem with the culture and accountability of the unit. The defendants' actions not only caused deep injury to Agent Jenkins, the judge said, but also caused incalculable damage to our national security. Their lack of professionalism, haste, and above all, blind prejudice led to this tragic outcome. Considering all the facts, the roles of each individual, Drummond was the instigator and the most aggressive, and the serious consequences of the incident, the judge handed down the final sentence. Bill Drummond was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The other 4 officers, Michael Riley, David Chen, Samuel Miller, and Anthony Davis, were each sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The sentences were somewhat disparate, reflecting Drummond's leading role, but they were severe enough to send a clear message about collective responsibility and the consequences of blindly following orders when those orders are wrong. Hearing the verdict, all 5 former police officers broke down. Tears, despair, and belated remorse were evident on their faces as they were led away by the judicial police officers to begin their sentences. Justice, though it could not restore lost service or erase the pain and humiliation Maya had endured, had finally spoken. A few months after the trial, Special Agent Maya Jenkins stood in the firing range at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The crisp, steady sound of gunfire echoed as she practiced shooting at a moving target. Her movements were precise, her eyes focused. Outwardly, she was still the professional agent she had always been, strong and fearless. But in the quiet moments between shots, memories of the Atlanta airport sometimes return. She doesn't feel gleeful when she thinks about the 5 men in prison. Instead, there's a complex feeling. Sadness at the failure of Operation Golden Eagle, frustration that a system she swore to protect could tolerate such wrongdoing, and a deeper awareness of the challenges she and her colleagues of color face every day, even as they wear the mantle of justice. The incident was a painful reminder that, sometimes, the greatest danger comes not from the criminals or terrorists she pursues, but from the toxic prejudices and abuses of power that exist in society, even among the ranks of those who should be her allies. She also thought about Carol Fletcher, the woman who started that disastrous chain of events. She was not malicious, perhaps just an ordinary person driven by fear and misinformation, driven by implicit bias to act rashly with devastating consequences. That showed that the fight against discrimination is not just about changing the system, but also about changing the awareness and thinking of each individual in the community. Maya lowered the gun and took a deep breath. The incident had left a scar, but it had not broken her. On the contrary, it had strengthened her resolve. She would continue her work, continue to fight crime and terrorism, protect her country. But now her mission had taken on a new meaning, to fight for equality, for respect, and to help build a future where no one, regardless of skin color or background, had to go through what she had gone through. She reloaded, raised her gun, and fixed her gaze on the target ahead. The fight was still long, but she was ready. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.